Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This is going to be my lore discussion on the Avatar Legends RPG Korra Era adventure, The Burning Fuse, which right now is exclusive to the starter set, but I believe will be made available to buy separately on some of the digital platforms at a later point. I don't think any of that information has been revealed yet. Like I got the starter set. I have a digital copy because there was a code in the starter set, and it says like early access basically on it. So I assume that, you know, it's just being like it's early access until they offer it for sale. So, as ever, we will go through this again. I don't really play the game as such, but there is some interesting information in this one because, you know, for the most part, you take what canon stuff that you can from the game, and even though the adventures can often be kind of tricky to know what you can and can't take as canon, there's enough here that I think it can create a bit of an interesting discussion here. So there are actually two new adventures as part of the starter set. They both come in this book here, which is the adventure booklet from the starter set, which you can see on the back here, mentions that the tables of contents is the Aang Era adventure, the Pirates of Crimson Sails, and the Korra Era adventure that we're going to talk about today, the Burning Fuse. So I'll do the Korra one today, and probably either tomorrow or on Saturday I will do the lore discussion, same thing as this video, for the Aang Era adventure as well. I will occasionally bring up the digital copy of this on screen, but as ever, because it's sort of quote-unquote exclusive content, I don't want to just show off the entire book and just kind of have the whole text be here in my video. But I'll do my best to explain it to you guys as we sort of go through. So let's just actually open this up here to start off with, so we get the kind of general intro here. This is the main kind of description of the Burning Fuse. So, in the wake of the Earth Empire's thwarted siege, Republic City is struggling to rebuild and heal the scars of war. The inventor Juniper Kim once worked for the Earth Empire, but now she develops peacetime uses for Earth Empire weaponry and tech. Early yesterday morning, Juniper discovered the spirit energy canisters and weapons were missing from her lab. In the wrong hands, the canisters and weapons can be deadly, and to make matters worse, many of the canisters have the potential to cause a devastating explosion. Juniper called her friend Asami Sato to help deal with the press flooding the scene and to help prevent a mass panic from gripping the city. But the police are stretched thin looking for the missing weapons, so she needs the help of some discreet allies to locate the canisters. Can the companions recover the canisters before Republic City's fresh wounds open once more? So the plot here is that basically we have a bomb in the form of kind of spirit energy canisters about to go off, and as we'll go through this, there are different factions that in this adventure can theoretically be behind the theft and be the ones about to set off an explosion to do varying kind of different things. And so as ever, the idea of these groups I think is meant to be canon, but there is no canonical way the story as such plans out overall, because straight away you get into this interesting idea of how does this exactly work. The adventure, of course, the idea is that you're meant to use your characters, and you can do that like if you want. Like there's basically two ways to do this adventure if you play the game. That is, make your own unique characters and you set the connections to the story, who your character is in the universe and how they know Asami to be brought in on this mission and stuff like that. Or there are pre-generated characters, and these are probably the most kind of weird ones in terms of how to kind of like describe from like a canonical point of view, because in this starter set they actually give you the kind of like kind of character sheets basically for these characters. So we'll go through this. I'll have them on the digital copy as well, but just to quickly show it off in physical here. You can see here that they're taking some of the character images that they've used in the other books to describe some of the characters, sort of like classes, the playbooks, and they're now kind of giving a name to them for this story. Now, the characters do have a bit of a description about who they are in the context of the story, but they are still technically classified as a pre-generated character. And so does that mean they're canon, that canonically this is how it actually plays out? But how does that work with the idea that there is no actual set path, that the way that this actually plays out, in that the whole book never explains who actually is the one who steals these weapons? So kind of what exactly do you do with that? So my assumption from a canonical point of view is going to have to be that I personally, I'm not going to put too much focus on the pre-generated characters. It's cool that they have art and there's a little bit going on with them, and potentially it could be interesting if those characters are actually canon. But I think for stuff like that, it is really going to take them being used in other material to make them stand out a little bit more. Whereas a lot of the setup characters that are part of the adventure feel a little bit kind of stronger in that sense, in terms of actually making them kind of canonical with the story as such. So let's kind of move on here. So I'll quickly get this kind of off screen here, and we'll kind of go through the whole idea of this. So we then go into sort of like the summary of what's actually going on here, and you'll see there'll be a few ways in which we go over the story. There's little bits of information scattered through all the different sections, but the idea is the heroes are helping this scientist, Juniper Kim, to retrieve stolen spirit vine energy canisters. And basically, whoever steals them is planning to set them off as an explosion to accomplish some sort of a goal on their side of things. So you have two questions to solve in this story, which is effectively find out who the culprits are and then actually stop the explosion from actually happening itself. So the premise, as we saw there, is that basically the heroes are brought in by Asami and Juniper to be the ones to investigate this. And the reason for that is that the police know about it, but they're not super helpful, as we'll get into. That's why this group of heroes is the one who's actually going to solve the issue here. And so, yeah, there is some interesting stuff here with the setup of, like, you know, former Earth Empire scientists, and the whole idea of we're using some of the advancement in technology that they did help to create, but trying to use it in the right ways. And, you know, that creates kind of problems by itself. So pretty interesting stuff, because, you know, the Spirit Vine tech was actually quite important in book 4. You know, that's quite interesting overall. They then go into a little bit of detail on Juniper's research itself, and the whole idea of, like, what she is trying to do. She's trying to use her talents to heal rather than destroy, and she finds other scientists and forms a team that is actually using this stuff in the right way. Now, they don't as such tell you what these good uses necessarily are, but you have to assume it's probably like just as a safe energy source type thing is kind of what we're going for here. And it's mentioned here that innovators and politicians, that's where she got funding to open up her lab in the industrial area of Republic City. And that's why they describe it. It's in a bit of a remote location, which I guess is kind of why the theft was actually able to actually happen. They describe here that the weapons and canisters were stolen the night before yesterday, and they are gone. Then we get into the basic idea of who are the 3 factions that are involved in this, who are sort of suspect, and depending on how you do the adventure yourself, could be how it actually goes down. The first one is the Peace Lily Society. So this is a group of students and philosophers, who it says here, formed after Kuvira's attack on the city. They oppose the use of technology and weapons invented through oppression of the Earth Kingdom's people. The group is led by a former university lecturer named Metog, M-E-T-O-G, and they've been expanding their rhetoric to speak out against the dangers of spirit energy and Earth Empire technology. A number of the most anxious and the most passionate peace lilies have been protesting outside Juniper's lab for weeks. They know Juniper is a former Earth Empire scientist and believe that she's up to no good, maybe even making new weapons. They'd relish a chance to shut down the lab and prevent any potential harm the research will inevitably cause. Then they have a section for the characters for each of these groups that's called leads and evidence. So like if you do decide that they're going to be the main kind of ones, this is kind of why it could be them. So first one here. The lab was breached by stealth and subterfuge. The scientists were subdued by non-lethal means. Gassed and emptied smoke bombs were left behind at the scene. Where did these come from? Peace Lily, the second one is Peace Lily Society members have been holding rallies at Avatar Korra Park recently about the dangers of repurposing weapons. They've gotten a fair amount of attention and won over more than a few concerned citizens. Could they have something to do with this? And then Matug, leader of the Peace Lily Society, has led many direct protests outside of the lab, insisting that action has to be taken to remove the weapons if the authorities won't do it. And then it has here a section, blowing up the canisters. The Peace Lilies want to blow up the canisters to get rid of them once and for all, so they can't be exploited by anyone else. They'll do this in a remote location, but will underestimate the size of the blast. In the case of the Peace Lilies stealing the canisters, a different organization should use their theft as an opportunity to steal weapons. So, there's a few ways you could do this. You can actually have one of the different groups steal it, and then, one of the other groups is the one to actually go about like re-stealing it and setting it off. So kind of interesting stuff here, kind of playing with the idea of, like, should this technology, should this research be a path that we actually go down full stop? And like we saw, like Varric kind of struggle with that himself, but now this is a clear attempt to use this technology in a better way, but people are still opposing it. Interesting idea of this kind of activist group kind of almost here. Then we have a triad up next, the Rising Flame Triad. This triad is led by a cunning and charming negotiator named Zhao Lan, which is Xiaolan. They are a small group of firebenders trying to make a name for themselves, and their leader, Zhao Lan, rose to power because of her lightning bending abilities and her grand ambitions. The criminals are struggling to find their footing ever since the triple threats united and then collapsed the city's criminal underground structure. Juniper's lab is on the Triad's turf, and they've been keeping a close eye on her movements since she set up shop. So that's a very interesting one, a new triad. I don't believe we've ever heard about this one before. Clearly some sort of a firebender kind of triad here, led by a lightning bender. So that is interesting, a new one here. I believe over the course of the entire book, that is the only mention of Zhao Lan being a lightning bender. They don't mention anything else about it, but I guess that's a nice origin story a little bit there. That's where the power came to be. So kind of similar to, the whole lightning bolt Zolt thing. It makes sense why a bender with those strong abilities would rise to a leadership position. It makes a lot of sense. So the leads and evidence here. The first one is quite interesting here. Scoochie. We know Scoochie, of course, tries to fleece the companions with a quick scam. Upon being caught, he offers to trade some information for his freedom. He's seen Rising Flames scoping out the area around the lab for the last 2 weeks. He knows they've been planning a big score. Second leads and evidence. There's word that the Rising Flames are offloading some very hot goods very fast to the right buyer. One of the companions, the third one, finds an empty hip flask with the Rising Flame Triad's distinctive flame symbol left behind at the scene of the attack. Blowing up the canister for the Rising Flame Triad, they will use the canisters to stop the transport of a Terra Triad prisoner. This may happen on a busy Republic City street, but that's all the better in proving this triad as a real threat. Since the Rising Flame primarily used bending, they sold the rest of the weapons on the black market. So there's their whole idea. They're, I guess, trying to take out a kind of rival triad member from the Terra Triad, which I believe also from the Legend RPG we now know is a thing again, because of course this was the triad mentioned in like Su Yin's backstory, but obviously with the whole triple threat thing in the show and then in the comics, a lot of the other triads sort of like fell into obscurity, but now we see some of the other ones rising up again, like creeping crystals and so on. So kind of some interesting stuff here about like what is the layout of the city when it comes to triads post turf wars is kind of interesting there. And then the final group is super interesting, the Equalists. So straight away, when was the last time in canon we actually heard anything about the Equalists? And some of you might go, well, I guess it was like book 1 of Korra, wasn't it? It was actually the Legend of Korra video game, the one with Hundun as the villain, and part of what he does is that he basically ends up kind of taking over the remnants of the Equalists, and they are kind of like part of his squad, and so that's why you have that Hundun having that sort of combined kind of force of like spirits and triads and an Equalist on his side. Now, one thing about this description as we go through this is that they never really reference that in the book. They very much reference like Amon, but the video game is never mentioned as being a thing that has particularly happened. Now, I understand how you can definitely write this without having to reference that, but it feels like for some of them you think like some of the people who are Equalist currently would have been Equalist during the events of the video game, so it should be mentioned, but who knows? Anyway, let's go into this here in the context of this story. On the more extreme end of the spectrum, the Equalists want the canisters to create a weapon and prove they're a threat to be taken seriously. Since Amon's death, Equalist numbers dwindled, but Kavira's attack on the city brought a new wave of recruits to the cause, which is quite interesting. The leader of the new Equalist movement is a man named Yoshiro. That is Yoshiro, who goes by the title the Iron Dragon. He plans to demonstrate his power by using the canisters as a great equalizer against benders. In his eyes, the Equalists need to adapt to the rapidly changing world as much as anyone. The destructive energy of the canisters is exactly what they need to even the odds against bender opposition. In the tunnels beneath the city, the Iron Dragon plans a potential attack on Juniper's lab to secure an asset he can use to grow even stronger. So that's interesting. We get the name of a new leader of the Equalists here, and he's quite interesting when we get into his specific kind of character bio later on. Leads and evidence for the Equalist, it says here, flyers and propaganda plastered in under construction residential zones and outside streets around the lab all point towards the Equalist cause. One of the companions spots a shadowy character in goggles and masks watching them from afar. When spotted, the mysterious figures quickly try to escape and slip into a nearby entrance in the tunnel. So, referencing chi blockers and their outfits. Juniper's scientists were blasted with electrified gloves and sticks, and the air is smoggy from smoke bombs, signature signs of an Equalist attack. And then for the Equalist blowing up the canister, Yoshiro will succeed where Amon failed, and the Equalist plan to blow up the Lucky Cranefish because they know a large group of criminal benders, aka the Rising Flame Triad, are based there. The Equalists took enough weapons from the cache to support their cause and stole the rest of for profit to use later. So that's interesting. You know, this is Yoshiro trying to basically full on just attack the rising triads once again. So that conflict beginning to come back up a little bit. So kind of interesting stuff with those kind of three groups there. A kind of activist kind of group against weaponry and basically against the very research into the kind of concept. A rising triad group and then the remnants of the Equalists. Pretty interesting stuff. Other players. So they say here, Detective Jiang is a character. The protesters themselves and also the press can also kind of like serve as roadblocks throughout this story. So Detective Jiang, of course, is the kind of officer in the city who is involved in this, of course. And it just mentions here, going across the idea of like, Jang knows about all this stuff, but he basically ignored the threat of this, and didn't have enough resources to do it. When it was clear the detective would be of no help and time was of the essence, Asami called the companions in. So this is the event that causes your hero team to be brought into play, of course. And yeah, there are protesters outside the lab, since the Peace Lily Society showed up. And the press, of course, is going to quickly get involved in this because there's so much activity around the lab and stuff like that. So that's the sort of idea that they're kind of playing with here. As we go through this section here, it just kind of quickly covers like ideas about like, how do you actually, as a GM, go through the story, and you very much play it as a ticking clock, a burning fuse, and that like it is a bit of a time crunch kind of situation, and things get more and more intense as things go on. They cover some stuff here, like there's a mention of like Julie Moon, of course, that like if there is a big explosion that goes off, Julie is of course going to have to come into play to declare a state of emergency and stuff like that. And this could bring out dark spirits. So they reference like a lot of stuff that could theoretically come into play if like worst case scenarios actually happen here. Then they quickly cover like how it ends. And again, there's nothing super specific here, but they cover the idea of like, well, if you locate the information quite early on, you can have roadblocks happen in the way of like fights, the press kind of coming into play, the detective gets in your way. Even if you do immediately get the canisters back and stop the explosion from happening, bringing them back to Juniper and Asami could be a final stage of the journey that could be really, really kind of crazy. And they talk about how it could end with like a chase through the streets where you're trying to protect the canisters from the Equalists to get back to Juniper in time. It could end with a really high stakes negotiation with the Peace Lily Society, and all that sort of stuff. They just kind of come up with theoretical kind of ideas about how to actually do this sort of thing. So that's all kind of like, fine. The introduction, they do mention here that, you can use the pre-gens to kind of help you come up with your characters if you want. The idea should be, based on what's happening here, is that all of the characters should have some sort of a connection to Asami, whether it be through her business or something like that. Because of course this is a specific group of people that Asami brings in on this. So your characters are all meant to be connected to Asami in some way overall. Because again, the way these works is that Asami is the legend NPC for this story. But as ever, they tend to keep the NPCs away from the being super involved in the story, where like maybe very end of the story Asami can get involved in the action, but for the most part she's just like the kind of client you're basically working for effectively here. And so yeah, the setup I think we have mostly kind of all done here, of like, you're set on the mission by Juniper and Asami. They'll give you your first leads depending on what way you actually want the story to pan out. And, the detective might get involved in things. You have to deal with the press, of course. That's what we're kind of like talking about here. Then I will bring this up on screen here, because this is quite important, I think. List of characters. So this is just a picture from it, just to kind of highlight what we're doing here, so you can keep track of all the names of all the characters involved in this. This is the list of important characters and groups in the story. So, Asami, we know. Juniper Kim is our main sort of new character as part of this, and that's a perfect description of her. A brilliant scientist hiding from her shameful past. Makes sense. The Equalists are Yashiro's kind of men in this situation. We have Yashiro the Iron Dragon himself, a powerful warrior bringing the Equalist out of hiding. The Rising Flame Triad themselves, they're looking to make a comeback. Zhao Lan, who is the charming and shrewd leader of the Rising Flame Triad. The Peace Lily Society, of course, student activists. Matog, of course, is their leader. Scoochie's involved in this. And again, you realize in stuff like that like, oh yeah, like Scoochie is an earthbender. That's not new information from the RPG. We've known that for quite a while, but it's just the idea that like we've never seen, I think, Scoochie earthbound. Detective Jan and the police group, protester group. That's kind of what we are dealing with here. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail, and I'll just keep the list of names up there while we kind of go through this. So it says here with Asami. Asami met Juniper while she sought funding for a lab in Republic City. Asami saw that Juniper's willingness to make up for past misdeeds was genuine, and the two became friends. When approached to help disarm the devices from Kuvira's mech, Asami put Juniper up for the job instead. During the adventure, Asami can't leave Juniper's lab unsupervised. She's using her resources to help Juniper keep all protesters and reporters at bay. Juniper has no experience dealing with the press, and this could be a PR disaster, and that's how, you know, Asami brings everyone into play. Asami is busy using her kind of, you know, celebrity notability in the city to stop this from just being a complete disaster, basically. Juniper Kim herself. Yeah, it was mentioned here. As a former member of the Earth Empire Science Division, she saw firsthand the devastation that weapons and technology could bring. She's ashamed of working on Kuvira's war machines, and ever since fleeing the Empire, after she's been trying to use her technical expertise for good. She's always anxious about what people think of her upon learning that she worked on the weapon that caused so much pain and suffering. Her past isn't a secret, but she's worked behind the scenes, and many are surprised to learn of her involvement. And so she's now been inspired to research peaceful uses of wartime tech in the hopes of undoing the wrongs of her past and helping the city. So, pretty cool idea for a character. I do wish they'd be a little bit more specific on what exactly the kind of usage of the tech actually is, because that would be interesting to know, sort of for the future of Avatar going forward. Like, in the next era, we assume some sort of spirit vine technology is going to be used going forward, but like, is it just as a kind of energy source? Like, basically, are we trying to get into the idea of like, spirit energy is effectively, I guess, to some degree, almost this like unlimited source of energy that like could lead to a huge technological revolution in the Avatar world. So this could actually be super important in the grand scheme of things. And then we have the Equalists. So is there anything particularly new in this iteration of talking about the Equalist? It says here, not everyone is willing to follow a charismatic would-be leader, but Yoshiro has proven he treats those who earn his respect as true equals. The Equalists operate as spies and saboteurs. They also serve as Yoshiro's personal guard and are never far from his side. The Equalists believe in Yoshiro's ability to rebuild the movement and respect his leadership and power. And you won't be able to sway them against him. The Equalists all have a personal history with benders that made them join the movement, from losing loved ones in Kuvira's attacks and losing their jobs to benders. So that's the whole idea. They will defend Yoshiro to the end if need be. So that is interesting, and like going forward, like I would really like to see like Yoshiro actually like turned into an actual character and just reference that this is actually a thing that is happening. Then we have the actual description for Yoshiro, the Iron Dragon himself. So Yoshiro has watched the Equalist rise and fall over the last few years with frustration. In a rapidly evolving world, he believes the Equalists need to adapt in order to survive. The exact way that Yoshiro has adapted multiple times throughout his own life. Yoshiro was the only non-bending sibling in a family of firebending prodigies, but proved himself by becoming an expert martial artist. He joined the United Forces only to lose the use of his legs after an accident. He eventually approached Equalist sympathizers and became the subject of an experimental procedure. By installing mechanical prosthetics modified off Hiroshi Sato's mecha tank designs, Yoshiro regained the use of his legs. Since then, he's dedicated himself to the Equalist cause with zeal. Filled with more desire that none should be made to feel lesser than another, an accomplished chi blocker, Yoshiro is always seeking to upgrade his mechanical prosthetics. He has adopted the Iron Dragon as a nickname, and he enjoys displaying his metal limbs both as a point of pride and to intimidate his foes. He wants the canisters to strengthen the Equalist arsenal against Bender threats. So that's a really cool description. Like, that feels quite fully fleshed out in that you kind of wonder, like, what exactly kind of happened to him. Like okay, from a firebending background, he obviously has siblings who are all firebending prodigies, family that are all firebending prodigies, but he is a non-bender, but he becomes an expert martial artist. He joins the military, specifically the United Forces, but something happens to him. So was it like a bender ultimately in some sort of a conflict that like injured him? That's kind of an interesting idea, because I guess he would have like been working alongside benders, but if he was hurt by a bender, that would make sense there. But the idea is that he went to Equalist, and it was the Equalists who sort of like did this procedure on him to give him sort of mechanical legs based off the mecha tanks, which I think is quite interesting. So again, would love to see a character design for this character, just to see what exactly kind of full-on like mechanical legs actually looks like in the Avatar world. Because like, of course, like Combustion Man has like a prosthetic leg that's a little bit sort of mechanical in nature, but it's not like mechanized in a way like this one. So that's kind of interesting. So very cool description there for that. The Rising Flame Triad, it says it's one of the weaker triads in the city. They quickly fell under Tokuga's efforts to unify everyone under the triple threats. Now that they're weakened, the Rising Flames saw a chance to claim their independence and push back against the rest of the triads. They respect their leader Zhao Lan. Although Zhao Lan may be more patient than most of her triad members, many of them want to see the triad expand beyond running numbers and managing a business. The Rising Flames aren't the strongest triad in Republic City, but their members tend to be quick-witted, sociable, and nondescript, which makes them consummate spies and information brokers. So that's interesting. So they feel a little bit different than some of the other triads, where they're not just kind of like thugs constantly doing like attacks like we've often seen other triads doing. They're a little bit more thoughtful, even if they lack the full power. So that's kind of interesting. So some triad members quietly work the Lucky Cranefish gambling tables as dealers or as waitstaff, gathering rumors and passing messages between patrons. In a fight, when push comes to shove, they use their firebending to trick and trip up their opponents. All members of the Rising Flames carry hip flasks with distinctive flame engravings, a gift from Zhao Lan when they join the triad. So, makes sense. And then Zhao Lan herself, an adaptable, cunning and charming negotiator, unafraid of the public eye. She genuinely loves entertaining guests at the establishment she owns, the Lucky Cranefish, drifting from table to table to make sure her guests are enjoying themselves. When it's time to do business, Zhao Lan maintains her affable attitude while trying to make the best deal for everyone involved. She considers herself like the flame, always vibrant, easily jumping from one situation to the next. She believes the triads are one of the last frontiers of freedom in the modern world. Each triad has the potential to shape their small part of the world thanks to crime into the place they want it to be. The law be damned. So I guess there's a slight sense of Dao Fei, I think, kind of coming in there. That's the kind of what I get there a little bit there. The only problem is the Rising Flames piece of turf is rather small to truly carve out the exquisite existence Zhao Lan dreams of, which is where the canisters come in. They're the perfect way to show everyone that she means business. So, interesting kind of idea for like a triad wanting to kind of really make a big move despite being relatively small. Then we have the Peace Lily Society, of course. Formed during the increased military tensions of the last few years, the Peace Lily Society oppose war and military actions of any kind. Easily identified by stylized lily pins, they're primarily composed of student activists and philosophers, but they include members across the four nations with lots of different training and expertise. During the rise of the Earth Empire, the Society organized protests and sit-ins to raise awareness, and they protested just as hard when the United Forces were called up. After the war, they also began to protest the repurposing of war tech, calling it exploitation of the suffering of others and pointing to the damage it's caused. Should they become confronted in the fight, they mostly use their defensive martial or bending arts to deflect or redirect opponents' strikes to avoid causing harm. The society members involved in this scenario are young, idealistic students, more overzealous than most. They might not start fights, but they make things very difficult socially for anyone who gets in their way or who determine them to be dangerous. So very different and more of a kind of complicated, I suppose, group to deal with here, because they're not a physical threat, but they seem challenging in kind of like different ways. So Matog, elected leader of the Peace Lily Society and a former university lecturer. She's gone a step further than the rest of the society by swearing off all worldly possessions and only using what is donated to her. Opponents of the society find Matog to be an insufferable hypocrite, appearing above all conflict while being incredibly condescending and passive-aggressive. It's impossible for her to forgive and forget the effects of war. Matog means well, but her dedication to her cause is absolute, and there's no room for compromise in her world. Many remark that it's lucky Matog's taking the path of non-violence, because otherwise she'd be deadly indeed. Matog is an earthbender, but only uses her powers defensively. So that's I think that's a pretty interesting kind of like description there of like a character who is more difficult to deal with in a discussion than in a fight. So that's interesting. Scoochie gets a bit of a description here. It's mostly kind of what we know about him overall. He prefers to use his earthbending to get himself out of tight spots, but he's not much of a fighter. So I guess that helps to explain a few things. He doesn't necessarily have the combat training that like a Bolin perhaps would have, but he can do, I suppose, some clever things to, I suppose, increase his movement to get himself out of situations. And yeah, basically sort of like information broker type character. Would like to see a return of Scoochie a little bit more, because he's always a pretty fun character when he turns up. Detective Jiang. So Jiang is a haggard middle-aged cop who's been on the force for a long time now. He recently lost everything in the wake of Kuvira's spirit cannon during the evacuation of Republic City. During the evacuation of Republic City, he was separated from his family and hasn't seen them since, so it's unconfirmed if they're dead or not. With his home destroyed by the cannon blast and no report of his husband or children, he presumes they were taken from him by the siege. While he's always been a man of action, these days he's become jaded, more willing to break the rules to get results than ever before. Jiang discovered his airbending after harmonic convergence and briefly spent time studying at Air Temple Island, but his short fuse and struggles with patience led to his rapid departure. He can easily fly off the handle if provoked or if he sees an opening. He's still cunning and clever, but he can let his already hot head and recent emotional trauma get the better of him very easily. His motto is that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, so he's taken this case into his own hands. He'll likely end up causing as many problems for the players as he might solve. So a lot going on there as well with this character, where like, you know, they just kind of keep adding kind of stuff on there. So we see here how he has a husband, does have children as well, but doesn't know what the deal is with them in the aftermath of what's gone on. That's just interesting by itself. So that's potentially now months that he doesn't know what the situation is there. So there's that. And then, yeah, the bit of backstory that this is one of the new airbenders as well, but kind of one of the ones that hasn't actually properly done much of the training. So kind of a fascinating thing, because like I really want more Korra content to address stuff like that like there probably are still other airbenders out there who have not come into contact with the new Air Nation, and like what are they doing with their abilities and stuff like that. So pretty interesting stuff overall there. So then we go into important locations, and I think for the most part this will be like the final kind of section of the video. So we have Juniper Kim's lab, which of course is in the industrial district overall. She bought a vacant warehouse, and obviously we know it is in the Triads, the Rising Flame Triads kind of territory, which is kind of, you know, why it's in the middle of everything. It's also, you would guess, probably near one of the kind of equalist tunnels as well. And so we know that's how there's like a connection to nearly all of the groups going on here. Plus there's protests going on outside it from the Peace Lily Society. So that's what's going on with this. And again, the whole idea is this is about spirit vines and various other experimental weaponry and stuff like that. They also mention the Republic City tunnel network here. They're not as well supplied as they used to be, but they still use them to get around. And the Iron Dragon, Yoshiro, is using them relatively well here. And you could be ambushed if you go into the tunnels, is sort of like the idea here. Then we have the Lucky Cranefish Gambling House. So this has been referenced a few times without us properly knowing that much about it. But the establishment is well regarded as a place to see and be seen by some of the shadier citizens of Republic City and rebellious socialites alike. An iconic painted sign featuring a plump, jovial cranefish holding coins and chopsticks greets the visitors as they approach. The Lucky Cranefish has something for everyone. Gambling tables for high rollers and thrill seekers, fine dining with separate booths, and even live music and dancing. The gambling house is the primary source of income for the Rising Flame Triad, who also conduct business out of private rooms on the upper levels. Whether the Rising Flame are thieves or not, the Lucky Cranefish is a good spot to try and pick up information. Anyone with a criminal background could easily have been here before, and urban residents of Republic City have likely heard of the reputation for this place. For the right price and some pleasant conversation, Zherlan herself will buy and sell information to the companions. If they can't pay the cost, she may still offer it up in exchange for a favor, one that will more likely be called in at the worst time possible. So, interesting idea here. I don't think we know too much about this. Like, have we really seen in Republic City, like, gambling dens kind of? So that's kind of interesting. Maybe we'll get more of a sense for like where exactly this stuff is when we get the Republic City book in a couple of months, and we maybe get like a map of the city that more clarifies this stuff. It'd be cool to get some of this stuff referenced. And then we also have this final new location here, the Auspicious Bear. The Auspicious Bear is a restaurant located near Republic City University in the Roku Plaza district of Republic City. So I don't remember if we've ever heard that before, that there's a Roku Plaza district in Republic City. The large square building has a restaurant in the front and various meeting rooms in the back. The meeting rooms house different student clubs and discourses that overflow from the university. The entire structure is built around a large central garden in the middle of the building, which is beloved by many of the restaurant's regulars. A statue of a chubby bear wearing a delicate hat sits at the base of a bamboo tree in the garden, which the owner of the Auspicious Bear swears is an authentic statue of the 52nd Earth King's bear, Bosco. On temperate nights, the sound of raucous discourse and laughter echo from the garden, and the restaurant stays open until the early twilight hours. The Peace Lilies host meetings at the Auspicious Bear. The owner of the restaurant, Sonam, S-O-N-A-M, knows most of them by name and is an old friend of Metog's. If hiding out from a chase or taking a moment to regroup, the Peace Lilies could visit the restaurant to figure out what to do next. Next section is just going over GM advice about like what way to go about doing it, basically how you actually go through with the story, if this is the actual group behind the theft and stuff like that, how to actually balance how much action there should be versus it being just a raw investigation, how much searching of the city should you actually do, and that whole type of thing. And they just kind of cover like, you know, that whole kind of situation, because we already covered the whole how it ends type situation as well. And the idea is, again, they also give you a little section on like, if you want to do an adventure stemming off from this, like, do you want to play this as just a one-shot adventure as is presented, or do you want to like come back and be like, oh, this is an event that is part of a larger adventure, and so the idea is that maybe you get in good with Chief Beifong after you've successfully helped out with this situation, and so you can do more stuff in the city and so on. So beyond that, they do give you the Asami Sato legend NPC kind of whole situation here. as you can see, but we've seen this before. There's nothing new in this particular version of it, so that's all fine. I'll quickly go over these just because it's somewhat interesting. I'll show them here. As I said, you get them in physical as well. These are the pre-generated characters, and unlike a lot of them, like I think the only times we've got images for pre-generated characters were in an urgent request, which were the characters created for the All-Star play, and then they're now utilizing some of the designs for these characters. Now again, they're pre-generated. Does that mean they are actual canonical characters? I really don't know, because they even talk, there's a section in the book that talks about like using the pre-generated characters, and that like you're free to change this stuff if you want. Like if you're playing this character, you don't have to do it in the exact way that they say here. So I don't actually know, but you can see there's a few things that are kind of interesting. This character is obsessed with pro bending, as you can see there. They're one of the new harmonic convergence airbenders, and they want to be the first airbender pro bender. So again, it's an interesting idea. I think a lot of people have brought it up. We don't know how exactly that's going to play, but you know, that's sort of the idea here. And yeah, this is Tenzin sending them on their first mission, which is getting Semo, one of the other characters, to open up a bit and connect with the world. So yeah, interesting enough. There's some stuff going on there with this character. So yeah, there's that. The rest of it mostly just, you know, technique and stuff like that, how to play. Samten, the idealist. So Samten's parents sold her to the Rising Flame Triad to pay off a debt and never came back. The only thing they left her with was a small book about the Fire Nation's dragons, which Samten is obsessed with. She read the book so many times, the binding has come apart. And dreams to one day visit the ancestral home in the Fire Nation to try and see one in real life. For now, though, Samten's managed to escape the Rising Flame Triad's clutches and even learned how to fight along the way. So, you know, interesting kind of enough. Wants to see a dragon. As far as we know, like, is Zuko's dragon Druk not one of the only dragons left? But obviously, like, some of the Legends RPG stuff seem to kind of imply that there are just other dragons out there, but we'll see how exactly that plays out. Yukon, so this is the Foggy Swamp character, grew up in the Foggy Swamp, eventually leading a squad of guardians who protected the swamp and nurtured its inhabitants. His teacher sent him to Republic City to see if any new technology could be useful to the tribe, but he's not impressed. He does not like the way city folk operate, of course. And he would happily leave the city, but he's promised to bring back a worthy piece of technology when he returns. Maybe spirit energy could be helpful if it's done correctly. So that is a bit of an interesting idea, because of course, like, Foggy Swamp tribe, located basically next to the banyan tree, which is effectively what Kuvira was doing, like kind of like quote unquote harvesting stuff in a way, like from that. So it's interesting in a way, for sure. Then we have Semo, of course, also one of the new airbenders, but obviously very different outfit, of course. An excellent student, she adopted traditional air nomad garb and styles to better speed up her training. She's nearly earned the title of master. So if this is canon, it's just like, here's one of the characters closest to becoming a master. Tenzin is hesitant to give her the title, but she hasn't integrated well into the new Air Nation. So the skill, yes, but not necessarily in terms of like other aspects, which is interesting. But Semo quite likes Asami Sato, so that's an interesting bit of a dynamic. If you consider this to be, you know, again, canon, considered to be important. Then we have Nyanzen, the Hammer. When someone kidnapped her best friend, Nyanzen followed the smugglers all the way from her home in the Siwang Desert to Republic City. She didn't have a plan. The Earthbender rarely does, but Nyanzen persevered nonetheless. When she finally found the smugglers, she pounded them into the ground before the police showed up to stop her and throw them all in jail. He was released, but she only got one last lead left, a person by the name of Zhao Lan, who runs the Triads, who might know her best friend's whereabouts. And I think that is it. After that, we just get into techniques, I think, which there's nothing super important. Probably the most notable thing is that there's no lightning technique for our triad leader character here. So that's all there really is to mention there. So overall, I would say a very interesting idea for a story. It's basic in a way, but I actually really like the three group dynamic, and that there's the potential in all of those ideas. The kind of reintroduction of the Equalists is cool. Finding out about other triads apart from the triple threats is always interesting, and the Peace Lily Society is also kind of somewhat interesting by itself. But I suppose, as usual, it has the same issues like a lot of the adventures have, which is that without the concrete idea of how canonically does the story actually play out, it's hard to care a massive amount about it. And I do wish that, like, if we are meant to consider, for instance, like, say, the pre-generated characters to be the canonical characters involved in this story, then there should be a canonical way the story actually goes. Because, like, if they're okay with guiding you down like 3 or 4 different paths that you could go down, I don't really see too much of a problem with them just being like, hey, do the story this way, the exact details to get to those exact points, do them yourself. I think that would be kind of helpful by itself as well. But, you know, that's just what we're talking about here. So, yeah, that's basically everything I want to talk about here. Like I said, I'll do the Aang adventure from the starter set probably tomorrow or the day afterwards. And then beyond that, we have, I think, the free RPG Day one, Movers and Shakers, is an adventure that will be coming out at some point. I'll cover that. When the Republic City book actually comes out, I think there's an adventure that's part of that one as well. So, and the book itself, of course. So I'll continue to do coverage on Avatar Legends RPG as we go forward. But for now, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on some of this kind of new Korra information in the RPG, which feels kind of a little bit more important than some of the other ones, just because this is all like set into the future, basically, because we in like Korra comics haven't really progressed the story forward all that much. It is very interesting when we get new like post book 4 content, because there really is the room to grow and like expand on Korra quite heavily, and I think a lot of people do want to see that. So let me know what your thoughts are and all the kind of plot elements, characters that are talked about here in the Burning Fuse. But other than that, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.